Police officers beat up an elderly disabled woman, confident of their impunity. But they had no idea that her son was someone they never wanted to meet. How will this terrible incident end? Will justice be able to prevail, and what consequences await those who committed this crime? Subscribe to the channel to not miss the denouement of this story and leave your comments. Your opinion is important. The sun shone brightly on a late autumn afternoon as Madeline Wilson, a 70-year-old black woman confined to a wheelchair, navigated the cracked sidewalks of her neighborhood. She had just finished a visit to the local bank, a small victory in her otherwise routine day. Despite her physical limitations, Madeline always managed to take care of her own affairs. Her son, Julian, a prominent attorney and activist, often offered to help her with such errands, but Madeline was proud of her independence. Even though age had taken its toll and an old injury kept her bound to a wheelchair, her spirit remained unbroken. Madeline, wearing a modest coat and scarf with her handbag resting neatly in her lap, moved down the street with ease. Her bright, alert eyes scanned the peaceful surroundings, and she smiled faintly at the sound of children playing in the distance. Her thoughts drifted to her son, as they often did. Julian was a strong man, successful and dedicated to justice. He had made a name for himself in the city, fighting for the rights of those who were often overlooked. Madeline was proud of him, but she had always been careful not to rely on his name or his influence. She had taught him the value of integrity, and she lived by the same principles. But on this day, Madeline would face a challenge she hadn't anticipated, one that would test not only her resilience but also the very foundation of the justice she and her son had fought for. As she turned onto a quieter street, heading toward her home, 2 white police officers appeared from around the corner. They were dressed in full uniform, their faces stern and emotionless. As soon as their eyes landed on Madeline, something dark flickered in their expressions. One of the officers, a tall man with a shaved head, narrowed his eyes as he approached her. "Hey, you!" he barked, his voice carrying the sharpness of authority abused. His partner, a shorter, stockier man, followed closely behind, eyeing Madeline with equal suspicion. Madeline, initially taken aback, stopped her wheelchair and looked up at the officers. "Yes, officer?" she asked politely, trying to maintain her usual calm demeanor. She had no reason to be alarmed. She had done nothing wrong, and this was her neighborhood. But the way they were looking at her made her stomach churn with unease. "We need to see your ID," the tall officer demanded, stepping closer to her. His presence loomed over her, and she felt the immediate shift in the air. The peaceful afternoon was suddenly filled with tension. Madeline frowned, confused by the request. "My ID? Is there a problem, officer?" "We ask the questions," the stocky one snapped, his tone dripping with impatience. "Just show us your ID, lady." Madeline reached into her handbag, her hands trembling slightly, not out of fear, but out of the frustration that was already building within her. She handed her identification to the tall officer, who snatched it from her without a word of thanks. He glanced at it briefly, his eyes narrowing even further as if the simple act of reading her name brought him some kind of displeasure. "This ID looks fake," he muttered, handing it to his partner. "You sure this is yours?" Madeline's heart skipped a beat. "It's mine," she replied firmly. "I've lived in this neighborhood for over 30 years. That ID is as real as it gets." The stocky officer let out a low chuckle, but there was no humor in it. He handed the ID back to her with a sneer. "You don't seem like the type who belongs around here," he said, his voice tinged with thinly veiled racism. "What are you doing in this part of town anyway?" Madeline's blood ran cold. She had heard comments like this before. Comments that questioned her right to exist in spaces where people like her weren't always welcome. But never had it come from a police officer. She looked up at the men, her back straightening in defiance. "I just came from the bank," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I live right down the street." The tall officer scoffed. "Sure you do," he said sarcastically, "and I'm the mayor." His partner, feeding off the growing tension, stepped closer to Madeline's wheelchair. "What's in the bag?" he demanded, pointing to her handbag. "You carrying something you shouldn't be?" Madeline felt her heart race, but she refused to let fear control her. "It's just my personal belongings," she said, gripping the handles of her wheelchair tightly. "You have no reason to go through my things." The stocky officer's face twisted with irritation. "We'll decide what's necessary," he growled, reaching out to grab the bag. Before she could stop him, he yanked the handbag from her lap and began rifling through it without her consent. Madeline gasped, a wave of anger and helplessness washing over her as she watched him toss her belongings carelessly onto the ground. "Stop that!" she demanded, her voice rising. "You have no right to do this!" The tall officer chuckled darkly. "We have every right," he said coldly. "People like you need to learn to respect the law." Madeline felt the words hit her like a punch in the gut. "People like me," she repeated, her voice shaken with fury. "What exactly do you mean by that?" But neither officer bothered to answer her. Instead, the tall one motioned to his partner, who threw her handbag onto the pavement and grabbed the handles of her wheelchair. "You're coming with us," the tall officer said, his tone final. "You're under arrest." Madeline's eyes widened in disbelief. "Arrest? For what?" The stocky officer didn't bother to explain. He simply began pushing her wheelchair toward their squad car, his grip rough and unkind. Madeline struggled, her hands flying to the armrests as she tried to resist. But her strength was no match for the officer's brute force. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. "I haven't done anything wrong." But her protests fell on deaf ears. The tall officer stepped in front of her, blocking her path. His eyes gleamed with cruel amusement as he leaned down toward her, his face inches from hers. "You don't get it, do you?" he sneered. "You're nobody. You don't belong here. And now you're going to pay for it." Madeline's heart pounded in her chest as she stared up at him, her mind racing. How had this happened? How had a simple trip to the bank turned into this nightmare? She felt a surge of panic as the reality of the situation began to sink in. These men had no intention of treating her fairly. They were using their power to humiliate and degrade her, and there was nothing she could do to stop them. The stocky officer yanked her wheelchair forward again, dragging her toward the car. Madeline's body jolted with each rough movement, pain shooting through her arms as she struggled to hold on. "Let go of me!" she screamed, her voice filled with fury and fear. "You have no right to do this!" But the officers only laughed, their cruelty now fully exposed. As they neared the squad car, the tall officer pulled out his handcuffs, the metal glinting ominously in the afternoon sun. Madeline's pulse quickened. This was wrong. This was also terribly wrong. She knew her rights, and she knew that what they were doing was illegal, but her words seemed powerless against their authority. Just as the officer reached for her wrists, something inside her snapped. Fueled by a surge of adrenaline and righteous anger, Madeline reached out and shoved the tall officer with all the strength she could muster. He stumbled back, momentarily caught off guard by her defiance. The stocky officer tightened his grip on her wheelchair, his face twisted with rage. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, lady," he growled. Before Madeline could react, the tall officer recovered from the shove and lashed out, slapping her across the face with brutal force. The impact was immediate. Sharp, blinding pain exploded across her cheek as her head snapped to the side. A stunned gasp escaped her lips as her vision blurred with tears. The world around her seemed to freeze, and for a moment, all she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She had been hit before, but never like this. Never with such hatred. She tasted blood on her lips as the officers dragged her toward the car, their movements rough and unforgiving. The tall officer grabbed her by the arms and began to force her out of the wheelchair. Madeline's body, already weakened by age and injury, crumpled beneath their assault. She felt the cold pavement beneath her as they threw her down, her head spinning from the pain and shock. "Get the hell up," one of the officers shouted, kicking at her legs. But Madeline couldn't move. Her body was too battered, her strength too drained. All she could do was lie there, helpless and broken, as the officers continued to berate and assault her. The last thing she saw before her vision darkened was the crowd that had begun to gather nearby, their horrified faces staring back at her in disbelief. Madeline lay on the cold, cracked pavement, her body aching from the blow, her mind spinning from the assault. The world around her blurred as she tried to comprehend what had just happened. Pain pulsed through her face where the officer had struck her, the sting of the slap still fresh. She could taste the metallic tang of blood on her lips, and her frail arms trembled as she tried to push herself up. But the strength she once had seemed to have left her completely. The two white officers stood over her like towering figures of oppression, their sneers twisted with an ugliness that only years of unchecked power could bring. One of them, the taller officer who had struck her, leaned down toward her again, this time with more menace in his eyes. "Get up, you old hag," he snarled, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you can shove me and get away with it?" His partner, the stocky one, laughed, a low and cruel sound that made the hairs on the back of Madeline's neck stand on end. "Yeah, show her what happens to people who think they can act all high and mighty, especially someone like her." Madeline's heart pounded in her chest, but her body refused to cooperate. She could feel her legs trembling, useless beneath her, as she tried once more to push herself upright. The wheelchair had been knocked over in the scuffle, lying just out of her reach. She reached for it, but before her hand could make contact, the stocky officer kicked it farther away, sending it skittering across the pavement. "Where do you think you're going?" he mocked, standing over her like a bully taunting a defenseless victim. His boots were inches from her face, and she could feel the oppressive weight of his presence. "You're not getting out of this one, lady." The tall officer grabbed her arm roughly, yanking her up from the ground as if she were nothing more than a rag doll. Madeline winced in pain as her body protested the harsh treatment, but she refused to cry out. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. "You're resisting arrest," he growled, forcing the metal handcuffs onto her wrists with such force that they bit into her skin. "That's gonna cost you even more time in jail." "Jail?" Madeline managed to say, her voice weak but filled with disbelief. "For what? I haven't done anything." The stocky officer bent down so his face was level with hers. "Oh, but you did," he said with a sinister smile. "You thought you could talk back, thought you were better than us. We don't let people like you get away with that." People like you. The words stung deeper than any physical blow could. The veiled racism in their voices was now out in the open, and Madeline felt the cold weight of their hatred settle over her like a suffocating blanket. These men didn't see her as a person. She was just an object of their contempt, a victim to be toyed with. A small crowd had started to gather around them. Neighbors, passers-by, people curious about the commotion. Some had their phones out, recording the scene, but no one dared to intervene. The fear in their eyes was palpable, and Madeline could feel the helplessness that hung in the air. She was surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. "Please, just let me go home," Madeline pleaded, trying to appeal to whatever shred of decency might still remain in these men. But her words seemed to only amuse them further. "You ain't going anywhere," the tall officer said, pulling her roughly toward their squad car. "Not until we teach you a lesson about respect." Madeline struggled against the pull, but her body was too weak, too frail. The cuffs dug deeper into her wrists, and she could feel her strength fading fast. The pain in her legs throbbed, and she stumbled, barely able to keep herself upright. She was no match for the brute force of these men, and they knew it. The stocky officer grabbed her wheelchair and threw it into the back of the squad car, as if discarding a piece of trash. He then opened the door and gestured for his partner to throw her inside. "Let's take her for a ride," he said with a sneer. "Show her what happens when you mess with the law." But before they could shove her into the car, Madeline heard a voice from the crowd, a voice filled with anger and disbelief. "Leave her alone," a woman shouted, stepping forward. Her face was etched with shock and horror as she watched the officers manhandle Madeline. "She didn't do anything wrong." The tall officer whipped his head toward the woman, his face twisting in irritation. "Mind your own business," he barked. "This doesn't concern you." But the woman didn't back down. "She's a disabled woman. What kind of monsters are you?" Her voice cracked with outrage, and she pointed her phone directly at the officers, making sure to capture every second of the abuse. Others in the crowd began murmuring in agreement, the tension building with each passing moment. Phones were raised and more people began filming, but the officers didn't seem to care. If anything, the defiance of the crowd only fueled their rage. "You're interfering with police business," the stocky officer warned, his hand inching toward the taser on his belt. "You want to end up like her?" The woman stepped back, but she didn't lower her phone. "I'm recording all of this. People will see what you've done." Madeline could feel the shift in the air, the crowd's growing unease, the weight of their silent judgment bearing down on the two officers. But the police seemed undeterred by the watchful eyes of the bystanders. They had no fear of consequences, no fear of being held accountable for their actions. The tall officer turned his attention back to Madeline. "Get in the car," he ordered, his voice cold and unrelenting. But Madeline was no longer able to stand, her legs buckling beneath her. The pain in her body was unbearable, and her vision swam with exhaustion. She had fought as hard as she could, but her body was failing her now. She collapsed onto the pavement, unable to move. "She's resisting," the stocky officer shouted, a twisted grin on his face. "She's making this harder on herself." "Resisting?" Madeline gasped, her voice barely a whisper. I can't move." But the officers ignored her words. The tall one grabbed her roughly by the arm again, this time with more force, and began to drag her toward the squad car. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, voices of protest rising in unison. "Stop! You're hurting her!" someone shouted. "This is police brutality," another voice called out. But the officers didn't stop. The stocky one knelt down beside Madeline, his face inches from hers, and whispered with a malevolent smile, "Nobody's gonna help you. People like you don't get saved. We're the law around here." The words sent a cold shiver down her spine. She had never felt so vulnerable, so completely at the mercy of people who were supposed to protect and serve. Her mind raced, searching for some way out, some way to end this nightmare. The stocky officer stood up and kicked her wheelchair aside again, this time sending it crashing into a nearby curb. The sound echoed through the quiet street, a brutal reminder of her helplessness. "Let's take her down to the station," the tall officer said, his voice now filled with a sickening enthusiasm. "Teach her a real lesson." As they moved to haul her into the back of the squad car, something strange happened. The crowd, which had been growing in size, began to shift from murmurs to shouts. People who had been silent were now shouting at the officers, their voices rising in collective outrage. "This is wrong," someone yelled. "Get away from her," another voice demanded. The pressure from the crowd was growing. Madeline could feel the change in the atmosphere. More and more people were stepping forward, their phones still recording, their anger palpable. The officers hesitated for a moment, glancing at each other as if unsure of what to do next. They had expected to intimidate, to assert their power without consequence. But now the eyes of too many people were on them. "Back off!" the stocky officer shouted at the crowd, his hand resting on his taser. "This is official police business." But the crowd didn't back down. Instead, they grew bolder, their voices louder. "You're going to get caught for this," one man shouted, stepping forward. "You can't just beat on someone and expect to walk away." The tall officer clenched his jaw, his eyes darting between Madeline and the restless crowd. He grabbed her by the arm again, this time with less confidence but just as much aggression. Madeline winced in pain as he pulled her up, but she couldn't hold herself steady. Her legs gave out beneath her and she fell back to the ground, her body collapsing under the strain. "She's faking it," the stocky officer yelled, frustration boiling over. "Get her in the car." But Madeline was no longer able to move. Her body had reached its limit. She lay there, breathing heavily, her vision blurring as she felt the weight of everything crashing down on her. The tall officer, his patience gone, raised his hand again to strike her. But this time, before the blow could land, a voice cut through the chaos. "That's enough." The scene on the quiet street had escalated far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The two white police officers, standing over Madeline Wilson's collapsed figure, were surrounded by a growing crowd that was no longer just passively recording the incident. They were now openly voicing their outrage. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. The tall officer, his hand raised to strike Madeline again, hesitated. His eyes scanned the crowd, recognizing that their control over the situation was rapidly slipping away. Before the blow could land, a voice rang out from behind the wall of people, cutting through the chaos like a blade through smoke. "That's enough." The voice was deep, authoritative, and filled with a simmering rage. The officers turned in the direction of the sound, and the crowd parted just enough to reveal the speaker, a tall, broad-shouldered black man striding purposefully toward the scene. His suit was sharp, his stride unyielding, and his presence seemed to command the attention of everyone in the immediate vicinity. This was no ordinary bystander. It was Julian Wilson. Julian's face, usually calm and composed in the courtroom, was now twisted with fury as he saw his mother, Madeline, lying helpless on the pavement, her body bruised and broken from the officer's assault. He had been on his way to visit her after an important meeting when he noticed a commotion from a distance. Now, standing in front of the police, his jaw clenched, he realized what had happened. And the sight of his mother, the strongest woman he knew, being treated like a criminal sent waves of anger coursing through him. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Julian demanded, his voice thick with a barely controlled rage. The tall officer, still standing over Madeline, sneered. "And who the hell are you?" Julian stepped forward, his gaze locked on the two men, his hands balled into fists at his sides. "I'm her son," he said through gritted teeth, "and I'm also Julian Wilson, attorney at law. You just assaulted an innocent woman, my mother, and I'll make sure you both answer for this." The recognition hit the officers like a brick. The tall one's sneer faltered for a moment, but the stocky officer, clearly not grasping the gravity of the situation, stepped forward, squaring up to Julian. "You better step back, sir," the stocky officer growled. "We're handling official police business here." Julian didn't flinch. His voice was colder now, filled with the practiced confidence of a man who had spent years fighting in the courtroom. "Handling it? You're breaking the law right now. You've committed battery, unlawful arrest, and you've abused your power. You think you're above the law because you're wearing a badge, but I assure you, you're not." The tall officer shifted uncomfortably, his bravado starting to waver under Julian's intense stare. The crowd, emboldened by Julian's presence, began murmuring louder, some even cheering him on. Several people in the crowd began calling out in agreement. "That's right," a man shouted. "You can't just beat on people like that." "Justice for Madeline," another woman yelled, raising her phone higher to capture every second of the confrontation. Julian's eyes darted between the two officers, sizing them up. He could see the indecision flickering in their expressions now. They were starting to realize that this situation was spiraling out of their control. But the stocky officer, too stubborn to back down, made one last desperate attempt to assert his dominance. "We're taking her in," the stocky officer snapped, his hand moving toward his taser. "You can't interfere with police business." Julian's voice dropped to a low, dangerous tone. "You lay another hand on her, and I will see you personally prosecuted for assaulting a disabled senior citizen. You will lose your badge, and you'll never work in law enforcement again." The stocky officer froze, his hand hovering over his taser. The weight of Julian's words hung heavy in the air, pressing down on him. He looked to his partner for support, but the tall officer had already taken a small step back, his confidence clearly shaken. Julian took another step forward, standing between his mother and the officers. His gaze was unrelenting, filled with the kind of righteous fury that comes from years of fighting for justice. "Call your supervisor. Now," he ordered. The tall officer hesitated for a moment before pulling out his radio, his fingers shaking slightly as he called in for backup and the presence of a supervising officer. The stocky officer, still too stubborn to admit defeat, muttered something under his breath but didn't make another move. Julian knelt down beside his mother, his face softening as he gently touched her shoulder. "Mom," he whispered, his voice filled with concern. "I'm here. I'm so sorry I wasn't here sooner." Madeline looked up at him, her face bruised, blood staining her lip. But despite the pain, she managed a faint smile. "You're here now," she whispered, her voice weak but steady. "That's all that matters." Julian's heart clenched at the sight of her, his strong, resilient mother, reduced to this by men who thought they could get away with anything. He turned his head slightly, glaring at the officers as they stood off to the side, trying to avoid the piercing gaze of the crowd. but the damage had been done, and they both knew it. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, and soon 2 additional squad cars pulled up to the scene. A supervising officer, an older man with graying hair and a weary expression, stepped out of the car and made his way toward the group. "What's going on here?" the supervisor asked, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before landing on the 2 officers. Julian stood up, his demeanor composed but still burning with anger. "What's going on?" he said, his voice sharp, "is that these 2 officers assaulted my mother without cause. She did nothing wrong, and they beat her while she was on the ground. I want them arrested and charged with battery, and I want an internal investigation into this entire incident." The supervising officer looked between Julian and the 2 officers, his face grim. "Is that true?" he asked the tall officer, who shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny. "We were just doing our job," the tall officer mumbled, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. "She was resisting." Julian cut him off sharply. "Resisting? A 70-year-old woman in a wheelchair? That's the best excuse you can come up with? She wasn't resisting anything. She was trying to defend herself from your assault. And there's video evidence," he added, gesturing to the crowd still recording the scene. The supervisor's expression hardened as he turned back to the officers. "You 2, step away. We're going to handle this properly." The crowd murmured in approval as the 2 officers reluctantly moved away, their faces now pale with the realization that they were in serious trouble. The stocky officer shot Julian a glare, but there was no longer any confidence behind it. He had been exposed for the bully that he was, and there was no saving face now. As the supervisor began speaking into his radio, calling for further assistance, Julian turned his attention back to his mother. He knelt down beside her again, this time with more tenderness, checking her over for any serious injuries. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have been here sooner. I should have been there to protect you." Madeline, despite the pain coursing through her body, reached out and placed a trembling hand on his arm. "You've always protected me, Julian," she whispered, her eyes filled with a love that even this brutal encounter couldn't diminish. "You came when it mattered." Julian felt a lump rise in his throat, but he swallowed it down. There would be time for emotions later. Right now, he needed to ensure that justice was served. As the police investigation team arrived on the scene, the supervising officer approached Julian once more. "Mr. Wilson," he began, his tone professional but respectful, "I assure you, we will conduct a full investigation into this matter. The officers involved will be suspended pending the outcome." Julian nodded curtly, his expression hard. "That's a start," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "But I'm not just looking for suspensions. I want them charged. I want them held accountable for what they did." The supervisor hesitated but eventually nodded. "We'll do what we can. I'll make sure you're kept informed." Julian's jaw clenched as he stood up, watching as the 2 officers were escorted away by their colleagues. They no longer looked so confident. Now they looked like men facing the consequences of their actions. The crowd began to disperse, many of them offering words of support to Julian and Madeline as they left. Several people promised to share the videos they had taken, ensuring that the world would see what had happened here today. Julian helped Madeline into a waiting ambulance, his heart heavy with the weight of what had just occurred. As the paramedics tended to her injuries, he sat beside her, holding her hand and vowing silently that he would not stop until justice was fully served. This was far from over. The fight for justice had just begun. The night after the brutal assault felt endless for Julian Wilson. He sat by his mother's side in the hospital, his face etched with exhaustion and fury, but his mind focused, already plotting the next moves. Madeline was resting now, her face bruised, her body sore from the rough treatment, but her spirit was still intact. Julian had seen enough violence and injustice in his career to know that this wasn't the end of their battle. It was just the beginning. Madeline had always been a fighter, and Julian had inherited that same fire. As he sat there, his phone buzzing with messages from colleagues, reporters, and allies, his resolve grew even stronger. The two officers responsible for the attack were being processed at the local precinct, but Julian knew it wouldn't be enough to simply have them suspended. They needed to be held accountable publicly, and not just as individual officers, but as symbols of a system that had allowed this kind of brutality to flourish. The next morning, Julian set everything into motion. By the time the sun rose, the videos of the assault had already gone viral, and the outrage was spreading like wildfire. Julian's legal team began preparing a formal lawsuit against the police department, not only targeting the two officers, but also holding the department responsible for fostering an environment where such behavior was allowed to go unchecked. Within hours, the public had rallied behind Madeline's case. Protests began to form outside the police station, calling for justice for Madeline and an end to police brutality. Signs bearing slogans like "Justice for Madeline" and "Stop the Abuse" filled the streets, and Julian used every tool at his disposal to make sure the world wouldn't forget what had happened. As the media coverage intensified, the pressure on the police department grew. The local chief of police, clearly feeling the heat from all sides, tried to issue a statement calling the incident a misunderstanding and vowing to investigate thoroughly. But Julian knew better. He wasn't going to let them downplay what had happened. Julian held a press conference outside the hospital where his mother was recovering, standing in front of a wall of cameras and reporters. His voice was calm, but his eyes were blazing with determination as he spoke. "This is not just about what happened to my mother," he said, gesturing to the hospital behind him. "This is about every person who has been subjected to violence and discrimination at the hands of those who are supposed to protect us. This is about a system that continues to fail Black and disabled citizens, treating them as less than human. My mother did nothing wrong, but she was treated like a criminal simply because of who she is. And we will not rest until justice is served, not just for her, but for everyone who has ever been a victim of this kind of abuse." The crowd cheered in support, and reporters clamored for more answers. Julian remained composed, deflecting their questions about the specifics of the case, but making it clear that this was only the beginning. He promised that he would pursue the case to the fullest extent of the law, and that he wouldn't back down until those responsible were held accountable. The court date came sooner than expected, as the pressure from the media and public forced the justice system to act swiftly. Julian stood before the judge, representing not only his mother but also the countless others who had been mistreated by the police. He presented the videos, the testimonies from witnesses, and the medical reports detailing the injuries Madeline had suffered. It was a compelling case, and even the defense lawyers knew they were up against a tidal wave of evidence. The two officers, who had once stood so confidently above Madeline, now sat at the defense table, their faces pale, their bravado gone. They tried to argue that they had simply been doing their job, that Madeline had resisted arrest, but their lies were exposed by the footage and the growing outrage from the community. It was clear that they had acted out of cruelty, not duty. Julian's closing argument was as sharp as ever, every word precise and deliberate. These officers thought they could act without consequence, he said, pacing in front of the jury. They thought that because my mother was old, black, and disabled, that no one would care. But they were wrong. We care. This community cares. And today we are here to show them, and everyone like them, that we will not tolerate this kind of abuse any longer. The jury returned its verdict swiftly. Guilty on all counts. The officers were sentenced to prison time for their assault on Madeline, and the police department was ordered to undergo a full investigation into its practices. There would be sweeping reforms, mandatory sensitivity training, and new oversight to ensure that incidents like this would never happen again. For Julian and Madeline, the verdict was a victory, but it was also bittersweet. The physical and emotional scars would take time to heal, and Madeline's trust in the system had been deeply shaken. But as they left the courthouse, surrounded by supporters and well-wishers, Julian knew that this was more than just a personal victory. It was a turning point. Weeks after the trial, Madeline and Julian sat together in her small living room, watching the news coverage of the case. Protests for police reform had spread to other cities, and Madeline's story had become a symbol of resistance against systemic racism and abuse. Julian had been invited to speak at several public forums, and he had taken up the mantle of fighting for broader reforms beyond his mother's case. Madeline, still recovering but regaining her strength day by day, looked over at her son with a soft smile. "You did it, Julian," she said, her voice filled with pride. "You made them listen." Julian shook his head, his expression serious. "No, Mom, we did it. Your strength, your courage, that's what made this possible. You've been fighting your whole life. I just followed your lead." Madeline reached out and squeezed his hand. "Maybe, but I'm proud of the man you've become. Proud that you're using your voice to stand up for what's right." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the news anchor discussed the new police reforms being implemented across the city. Julian felt a sense of closure, but also a renewed purpose. His fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but now they had momentum. Now they had a platform. As the sun began to set outside the window, casting a golden glow over the room, Madeline leaned back in her chair, content. She knew that the road ahead would still be difficult, but she also knew that with her son by her side they could face whatever came next. Together, they had turned pain into power, and with each passing day, the world was changing, slowly but surely because of it. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new episodes. Click on the bell to be the first to know about the latest videos. Leave your comments. We value your opinion. Where are you watching this video? Share your thoughts and don't forget to watch our other videos. They will definitely not leave you indifferent. See you in the next stories.